and welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's my honor today to have John Stemberger from the Florida Family Policy Council, and most recently the designer of COVID Church Aid. And I'm glad to have him on today. I want to talk about a key question. John, how are you this morning?
Great, Josh. Thanks for having me on the show here.
Well, John, I wanted to explain just a little bit about your background to the guest. And there's this old idea about a Renaissance man that supposedly would be able to solve physics problems and then jump over somebody's head. It's one of those old ideas. And if there is a postmodern Renaissance man, I consider that to be John Stemberger.
Very kind, thank you.
Let me change my.
I don't do math though. I don't do math at all.
But
my kids remind me, Dad, you got really bad grades in math and you came out okay. So
it's all right if they do. But John is the head of the Florida Family Policy Council, an accomplished attorney, and also former Scout, or Eagle Scout and Scoutmaster, and then helped form Trail Life USA, which would be an alternative to the Boy Scouts, and just a leading voice there in the state of Florida and really around the country on issues of faith, family, and freedom. I wanted to point out two really interesting things that you've done. One being on Florida's Constitutional Revision Commission. So actually taking a look at your state's constitution, being a part of that. And then we were talking about this a little bit before we jumped on. Her name was Rivka Berry, a Muslim teenager from Ohio who came to Florida after she was threatened to be killed by her father because she converted to Christianity. I just think that's a fascinating story. Maybe just a minute to let our listeners know a little bit about what you've been doing. Would you jump into that just for a second?
yeah, so every 20 years in Florida, we have a Constitutional Revision Commission. That's a historic thing. I don't think any other state has something like it. It's a 37-member commission that the Attorney General is automatically on. I was appointed by the Speaker of the House in Florida to serve on that, and I did for a whole year. We proposed over much of my objection because I didn't like a lot that the commission was doing, but we proposed about 8 amendments, and 7 of them passed by the people of Florida, over 60% approval rating.
Wow.
And then also about 10 years ago or so, actually probably more than 10 years ago, I represented Rivka Berry, who was at the time a young teenager who had fled from her family out of Ohio. She was threatened with an honor killing for converting to Christianity. She hid her faith for a long time. She actually took a bus here to Orlando, and so there was a big international case and dispute whether the court in Ohio or Florida had jurisdiction. We wanted to keep her here. We thought that she was safer here. Her story is in a New York Times best-selling book called Hiding in the Light. She's a very good friend of mine. I consider her to be almost an adopted daughter, and she's engaged to be married and asked me to participate in that ceremony. So I'm very pleased to announce she's doing very well and living in Texas. She's actually a second-year law student actually as well in Texas.
Wow. Well, we'll link to that book in the show notes. I had just come across that story. I'm really fascinated to follow up and read that book. So John, I wanted to jump into a question about the CARES Act and whether or not churches should accept funding from the CARES Act. Now, yesterday I was doing an interview or kind of a program for about 40 pastors or so on what the CARES Act entails. And I think your new website, COVIDchurchaid.org, does a great job of kind of explaining what the CARES Act is. But before a pastor would get to all the details about how they would apply for that aid, there's this question, and that is it biblical? Is it wise for church leaders to be accepting what is in a sense a government loan / grant? When I had a pastor tell me today, like, you attorneys, you've been telling me for years the government's coming after us and be careful of the government, and then you're encouraging me to take a loan from the government? What's wrong with you people? So I think that's a question that's on the hearts and minds of many church leaders as they want to do the right thing. And I saw yesterday that you had put out a 10-point analysis on this from a biblical background, but also kind of from your experience in the public square. And so I wanted to jump into that and to walk through those with you. But before we do go into the 10, perhaps would you have any introductory thoughts on just kind of setting up this question?
Well, I think the question should be for pastors and nonprofits, is there any ethical or moral issue or constitutional issue which would prevent a minister or a pastor, the leader of a faith-based nonprofit, a Christian nonprofit specifically, from taking this aid. The aid specifically, just so that we're clear, is a loan. It's a loan which then turns into a grant. And it's facilitated, by the way, through your bank. So it's not you dealing directly with the government. You're actually dealing with a bank who is then dealing with the government. So it's even farther removed from that. So just to understand the nature of what we're talking about a forgivable loan that turns into a grant, and you receive the grant or the loan through your local bank who is authorized to do business through the government through this. So that's what we're talking about. And my conclusion here, which we'll talk about the reasons why, is that I do think it's permissible. I don't think there's any ethical, moral, or biblical prohibition or even issue with a church or religious nonprofit taking these funds. Now, obviously, some people can just knee-jerk and say, you know what? I want to trust God. I don't think we should be involved. I'm not comfortable with this. And if that's your reasoning, that's fine. That's a perfectly acceptable position. But I think there's several reasons why it is okay to consider this as an option.
And so I've concluded that this is an issue of Christian conscience, and that there would be some that would say, no, I'm not going to take government funds. Like you said, I'm going to depend on God, and I'm worried about the relationship between church and state. On the other hand, I know that there are pastors that are facing disaster scenarios in their ministry, and they're saying, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and apply for this. And so that's been my position as well. Why don't we jump into these 10 points? And I thought this was just so helpful. So number one is that there is no express biblical prohibition against churches taking this type of aid. So would you jump into that one?
Yeah, so the first place we look is Scripture. Is there anything in Scripture which would prohibit this? And I think the answer is no. And a lot of people would say, well, there's no examples in Scripture where any churches or Christians were ever helped by the civil magistrate, were ever given funding by the government. Well, you don't argue from the absence. So the absence of, even in legal terms, the absence of law creates the liberty to do something. If you don't have to pass a law to proscribe something, but if something is not addressed in Scripture, then we have areas of Christian liberty. You can exercise conscience to actually do those things. So I don't see any clear biblical principle here that would control the outcome of this. And so that's the first place I think we go, is that there's no biblical prohibition. And there are other reasons as well, but I think that is the first and the most important one.
Sure. And I have heard references to Joseph and Pharaoh, that Joseph had God's wisdom, but he needed the Pharaoh's authority to save people in that area from starvation. Now, that is a complicated passage, and I'm not sure that it's prescriptive of what government should do. Another one is Nehemiah building the wall with the assistance of the Persian Empire. I mean, so, there's some examples here, but like you said, certainly from the New Testament, I don't see an explicit prohibition, or in a sense, an explicit example. And Rome was busier killing Christians than they were assisting them. And so that's, I think, very helpful. That's number one, no express biblical prohibition. Number two, if churches are damaged or fail because of the crisis, the welfare state will expand further.
Yeah, so this is a very important point. Collectively, charities and nonprofits and churches provide an enormous, just a vast body of social services and human support. And that is the way it ought to be, frankly. The government shouldn't be there with welfare checks and poverty programs. It ought to be the church. And if those nonprofits fail, you can be doggone sure that the government is going to be right there to expand its social services, to expand the welfare state, and expand the redistribution of wealth. I mean, if churches and nonprofits fail through this crisis, it's a socialist dream come true, because then the government expands. Oh, we need more welfare. We need more programs to help these people who are not being helped. So if you're an economic conservative and you don't want to see the expansion of the welfare state, you should be all for this, because this can help churches and charitable nonprofits to do their job and to make sure there's no hiccups, that they're continuing to do their mission. Because there are going to be some nonprofits that will literally fail through this crisis, depending on how far it goes, if they cannot sustain themselves or just be severely damaged through having to lay off numbers of people.
Yeah, not much to add here, but I was thinking about the halo effect, and listeners of the podcast would be familiar with that term, of a study in Pennsylvania done of several churches in an urban setting, and the estimate that each one provided something like $4 million of benefit to that area. And then also just speaking to some key denominational leaders, they are concerned that something like 25 to 30 churches in the denomination might drop out, might fail because of this. And so that's a real issue moving forward. So that's helpful. That's number 2. And by the way, listeners, you don't have to worry about trying to put these in a note while you're driving or jogging. We'll have these in the show notes for you and a link to the actual website for you to read. Number 3, there's no such thing as government money, only taxpayer money.
That's right. I mean, this may seem like an obvious thing, but it's something we should remember. There's a difference between government control and taking a subsidy. And, the government cannot produce wealth. It has absolutely no ability to produce wealth. It doesn't own any money. All the money that it has is from taxpayers. And the government simply is a steward of that public funding. On top of that, the nonprofit or the church is dealing with a bank and getting a loan from the bank, which then the bank has a contract with the government. So it's even more extended than that. So to say that we're taking government funds is not actually accurate. So you have to consider that as well.
And I think that's an important point. And I've been sharing this with a few people, and normally I get some sort of head nod or amen when I say there's no government money, it's only taxpayer money. Number 4, churches often use public services like roads, police, and firefighters provided by the government and paid for with taxpayer dollars.
That's right. I mean, churches, along with the rest of society, because of our tax dollar, there are some things that are legitimate functions of our tax dollars that everybody uses: roads, police, fire, infrastructure, utilities, those kinds of things. And so the church would never say, oh, I'm not going to drive on the roads because it's paid for with government money. It's taxpayer money, but it's a form of the common good. It's a public accommodation that everybody in society has access to. And similarly here, they have actually crafted a relief package that almost every single charity, every single church, and every single citizen in a personal way will make use of. So I think that there's an analogy there. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's certainly a factor to consider when considering whether or not you should take this aid and these loans and grants.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a second. And as attorneys, like normally I'm the only attorney on the line. So yeah, you can do that real well. But I think the question could be, well, what about property tax exemptions? What about the housing allowance? I mean, these types of benefits, or I would say the kind of recognizing the value of the church, has already come under attack from case law, also just kind of a general sense or idea in society that, well, why are we, in a sense, subsidizing churches by giving them these benefits? Do you think that that affects that argument long term?
So this is an interesting question, because the reason that churches are tax exempt is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So they're tax exempt. That is that churches should not be taxed along with the rest of society, because that would be basically the church penalizing or requiring that. Now, there are some local taxes that churches have to pay, and that's been held to be constitutional. But for the most part, we don't tax churches, and churches are tax exempt. Contributions to churches are tax exempt for that very reason.
So the argument would be, just by, again, participating in this loan/grant, which is actually overseen by a bank, that's not changing the dynamic between church and state in a real strong way.
Not if this is not an ongoing program. It's a singular program, and for that reason, no.
I thought number 5 was a really interesting and good point, and that is, like an eminent domain, when the government takes something of value, it must provide just compensation. And I'll just tell you, this was kind of the first thing that jumped to my mind when I was thinking about this, the kind of that comparison of the government coming in, taking somebody's home or business, and then having to pay them a value for the use of it. And so would you explain that one?
Yeah, so in the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment has what's called the Takings Clause. And this is where we get the concept of eminent domain. If the government is going to take your property for some supposedly a good reason, it has to provide just compensation. And so in this case, it's not an exact analogy. I'm not making a constitutional argument. I'm just saying there's a principle here. In this case, the government has ordered, local, county, state, and federal government has ordered businesses and nonprofits and churches to close by virtue of the fact that we're trying to keep people separate to avoid the spread of this disease. And as a result of that, it is creating economic harm. It is creating loss, economic loss. And so this relief package is in essence compensating people for the loss that they're having as a result of the government ordering you to shut down your operation and not function the way you normally would.
And I think that will sit well with a lot of church leaders, because I know at the beginning of this, there was a lot of wrestling with, is this something we should comply with? I'm not sure how serious this is, but then I think the consensus developed, hey, we need to be good neighbors, and we need to shut down, despite the fact that a lot of churches rely on people showing up and putting an offering in an offering plate still. And that's just not showing up like it used to. You can try to make it up with online donations, but I think Tom Rainer's been doing some good work on projections about expect the loss of 30, sometimes 50% of your church income. And so this is a good principle to think about. Number 6, to be constitutional, Congress must provide the same aid to every nonprofit, including religious nonprofits and churches. And I think that's most recently the Trinity Church versus Comer decision, I think out of Missouri, that emphasized this principle. Would you explain that?
Yeah, so the current case law from the Florida Supreme Court says that if you're going to provide aid to the society and to businesses or whatever it is, churches, groups, you cannot discriminate because those groups are religious in nature. You have to provide the aid across the board. And so I think that case involved a program where you got a reimbursement. The Trinity Lutheran case, the church basically had a local program had a situation where if you use the soft, what do you call it? It's a gravel,
Rubber,
soft,
yeah.
safe gravel to make a foundation for a playground, right? Made out of plastic and rubber things. And if you use that, then the city or the county would reimburse you funds for that. Well, Trinity Lutheran did the same thing. They applied for the reimbursement and they were told they couldn't have it because they're a religious organization. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you cannot discriminate based upon the church. If it's a program that's available to any group, it should be available to all groups, including religious organizations.
Absolutely. And also an interesting case just close to me was the Ark Encounter that had applied for an exemption, I think a sales tax exemption that was available to things like Six Flags. And they were denied it, and they argued, hey, you're denying it because we're religious, and they ended up winning. So that's a key factor, a key principle to keep in mind. Number 7, this is not a permanent flow of funding, causing an ongoing reliance by the church on the state.
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly we do not want churches to be tied to the government. That's very clear. We do not want government to control churches. We do not want churches to rely upon government. They need to be an independent, prophetic voice into the culture. They need to be prepared to, aid when they can and be a part of the solution. They can partner with providing services. But this is not a permanent flow of funding. It's not an ongoing reliance by the church upon the state. I mean, we've never experienced in the history of at least our country in any kind of contemporary sense, anything like this, right? I mean, there have been pandemics before, but because transportation is not as rapid, right? We don't have that because we're in an international situation. Now this has affected the entire globe. This is very unprecedented, and so this is a one-time unprecedented thing for a unique assistance for most Americans and almost every church and smaller nonprofits. And so I think that it's distinguished because it's not something where, church government saying, now churches, we're going to fund you on an ongoing basis. It is just a one-time help. Now, there may be some supplemental aids if they run out of funds, let's say too many churches and they exhaust the funds, there may be a supplemental thing, but still it's not intended to be, nor do I foresee it to be an ongoing source of revenue for the church.
I was thinking about the analogy of school vouchers. And we have a school voucher program here in Indiana, which is actually an ongoing program, but the money goes to the parents and then the parents pay it to the school. But it is kind of this ongoing form of support. And I would state that it is from the parents. Parents make the decision, but the schools have come to rely on that. And so I think if a church is comfortable with receiving that kind of funding, because there's no non-discrimination statement required, et cetera, then certainly I think this is actually less intrusive because it's not continuing in nature.
Right.
The next one is the money is intended to be a loan that will be forgiven, but the loan can also be paid back.
That's right. I do want to run back, Josh, for a second to our initial point, and that is the Bible does address debt, and it does warn us about debt, the dangers of debt, and to not be in a situation where we're having to rely upon someone. So that certainly is a factor. But again, remember, this is not a pure and a serious loan as a traditional loan would be. It's going to be forgiven. So it's really more of a payout to help with our own taxpayers' dollar. And the other thing is that if the church is not comfortable with that, they could actually pay it back. So if they wanted to get a short-term loan, if they wanted a low-interest loan, the loan, if they do decide to pay it back, the time period is up to no more than 4% interest rate. Which is pretty good for the bank, actually. But so again, the loan can be paid back. It doesn't have to be forgiven. And if the church wants to do that, they can simply do that and not have it transferred into being a grant.
That's helpful. The next one, and I think this is huge, there are no strings attached to these loans and no control being exercised by the government over a church's beliefs or function. And I think a lot of pastors are like, really? It sounds a little too good to be true. Now, I have heard one concern that there's no explicit statement which says that if you're receiving this, you're not a recipient of federal funds, which I think could affect some Christian schools. But the argument in response is, well, there's also this extended relationship, the relationships with the bank, not with the federal government, at least contractually. So would you jump into that one? There are no strings attached to the loans.
Yeah, so again, this is the most common concern. It's my concern. It's everybody's concern whenever the government is involved with partnering with a church or something like that, or let's say there's a lot of homeless programs. I remember George Bush was very big on, let's have this partnership. Why are we allowing government programs at a high level to provide services that churches are providing? Why don't we just fund those local nonprofits and they can do it more efficiently and do it with more humanity as well? But again, there's no strings attached at all in the CARES Act. Again, it's a loan. There's no requirement for the church to do something or not do something. And so it's just a very different situation. Now, I will say this, there are some regulations, some further regulations helping banks to understand how to process these things that will come out on Thursday or Friday, April 2nd or 3rd. It's theoretically possible that something could show up in those things, but I think if they do, it would just destroy the whole purpose of it. So as we sit here today, there's nothing like that. And I don't anticipate anything being put into that as well.
Sure, and I've certainly encouraged pastors to take a close look at the loan document, but certainly from the actual text of the legislation, there were no actual strings attached. Number 10, and I think this is a really helpful conversation, not just about the law, but also about public theology, and that is that the biblical role of government is to restrain evil, but I think sometimes we forget the second one, and it's right there in the text, and that is to promote the common good. And much of government's response to this crisis falls within those broad goals.
So Josh, this is the most misunderstood question in our entire civil discourse. I remember being in England with an American presidential candidate who was known as a Christian, and I just simply asked him the question, what is the biblical role of government? And it was as if, deer in the headlights. This is a very important question, and it's clear throughout church history, from St. Augustine to contemporaries like Chuck Colson, that there's two purposes of government, according to the scripture now. Number one is to restrain evil, and that's everything from the military restraining, hostile nations from attacking us down to local police. So restraining evil, laws that restrain evil things. And so that's purpose number one. Purpose number two is to basically promote the good, or promote justice, or promote virtue. And again, both of these questions drive us back to what is evil? What is good? So it drives you as a moral analysis.
Yeah.
Our libertarian friends would argue that no, the purpose of government is to merely increase human liberty. Well, what does that mean? To do what? To murder, to it doesn't have any moral framework. So just increasing human liberty, if that's the role of government, then its logical extension is anarchy, because you have no sense of where to place parameters. But the biblical role of government to restrain evil, to promote good, gives us the question. It's a moral question. What is evil? What is good? And we start from there, and then we see a thing doing that. Now, we have to be careful here, because a lot of the welfare programs and things that are socialism, liberation theology can say, oh, it's promoting the public good. Let's just take from everybody and redistribute it because it's promoting good. No, I think because that's violating the commandment, thou shalt not steal, at some point, right? I mean, we know that private property is biblical because of the presupposition in thou shalt not steal is that there's private property. Otherwise, you could steal from anyone, and it wouldn't be immoral.
Well, and as I talk to churches about this, I kind of laugh at them a little bit about, well, all right, it says punish evil, promote good, but you also have to understand, well, whose definition of evil and good, as you've suggested, is Scripture talking about? Well, it is the Bible, so it's God's definition of those things in Romans 13. Also think about 1 Peter 2 and other passages. So I think that's helpful, and you're saying that this act falls within that broad spectrum of what God has said, here's the government's role. And because in some, there's no specific prohibition, especially if a church is in a disaster scenario, we would lean into Christian conscience and say, we're not going to tell you can't go ahead and get this aid to help keep your doors open.
Yeah, so I think to apply, and I think this is actually true, and there's a lot of reasons why we could criticize government, Josh, and you and I do that regularly, actually, along with the policy council in your state. But I think that here is one area where the entire government across the globe, almost every government, is actually exercising the biblical role of government, is to restrain the common enemy and the natural evil of this virus, number one, and then trying to do things to promote the common good, to promote virtue, and to promote just results. Or at least America's doing that with this CARES Act, and the United States Congress and the President has done that with the CARES Act, because it's trying to help us to do our job to continue common good.
Well, I really appreciate you putting those 10 together. This really helps sharpen my thinking, and I hope it's going to help sharpen the thinking of the church leaders that are wrestling through this. We have just a few minutes left. I did want to give you a moment to just explain COVIDchurchaid.org, which I think is an excellent resource. We put out some stuff on this, but I tell church leaders out there, go avail yourselves of all the resources kind of across the board for ministries. So would you explain a little bit the reason for putting it up, and then the resources that you have there?
Sure. We launched a national website called COVIDchurchaid.org, COVIDchurchaid.org. And this is a site for churches and pastors to get information specifically about the CARES Act, how to apply for it, what are the details, what are the resources, and also other resources about how to live stream your services, how to think about home education for parents that are now put their kids in public school but now have them at home. So it's just a variety of resources on how churches can think about this, sample sermons, perspectives. And so we try to put some of the best materials from all across the country in one site. So it's COVIDchurchaid.org. And it's applicable in all 50 states because everything there is federal in nature, even though we've done it here from our Florida Policy Council.
Nice, and we'll certainly include that in the show notes. And I would note there's also an audio from a conference call with Senator Marco Rubio, and I'm not endorsing one party over the other, but he was on to talk about this as a federal official, and I know that call's been very helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, so, and it's one of the clearest, most biblical and Christian responses to this crisis I've ever heard. It's remarkable to hear him integrate theology and history and public policy during the interview. It's a great interview. It's been listened to over 12,000 times, and it's awesome. A great resource. It's on the web as well.
Yeah, I encourage listeners to go over and listen to that as well. So we have just a few minutes left here, but I did want to kind of jump into just a brief conversation about what's going on. You're there in Florida, in Orlando, and just yesterday, a pastor from the Tampa area was arrested for holding services despite a quarantine order. And I'll often say on this program, I defer to Christian conscience many times, especially in a local pastor's decision to lead his congregation. I think Hebrews 13:7. But also I think we need to apply wisdom. That's another big principle. And so would you maybe just comment on that just a little bit, and also Mayor de Blasio's comments about, hey, we're going to shut churches down permanently. if they violate these things?
Yeah, so there's two considerations here. First, to pastors, I think that the largest overriding principle is Ecclesiastes 3, and that is there's a time and a place for everything. As policy councils, the 40 some odd policy groups around the country, we're all kind of associated and work together. We are very involved with opposing the government, fighting the government, looking out for our rights. And there's a time and a place for that. There's also a time and a place to say, you know what? We need to love our neighbor. I mean, this whole crisis, our response to this crisis, the government's response to this crisis is a pro-life argument. We're trying to serve our neighbor from getting sick or perhaps having a disease that could actually kill them if they're elderly or have severe medical conditions. So this is a pro-life act. I mean, we are loving our neighbor as ourself when we're choosing not to engage, not to be socializing with other people, because we do not want the rampant spread of this virus. It's a very pro-life act. It's a very biblical act. We're serving our neighbor, we're loving our neighbor, and we're reserving our rights, which we could assert otherwise in the context of churches or individuals, to do otherwise. So to me, I think that if I were a pastor, I would say that's more important than exerting our rights. Now, as it relates to the specific law as to whether it's constitutional, as you know, Josh, being a lawyer, there's a principle of general applicability. So if the government passes a law and says all groups that meet together, irrespective of whether religious or not, cannot meet if there's 10 or more people, or whatever guidelines they choose, and they don't target religious organizations or churches, that's constitutional on its face if there's a compelling government interest. And it's, as you said before, it's hard to think of a compelling government interest more compelling than a pandemic that's worldwide, which does affect our country. So, that's number one. But if the order were to target churches, or if it were to say just churches have to close and everybody else has to close, that's a problem. That's a problem. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the church is making the argument that the city of or the county of Hillsborough in Tampa has exemptions for other groups to meet, but they don't have exemptions for churches. And so they're saying it's not narrowly tailored. And if they had it narrowly tailored, that it would be good. And so that's the situation there. I wish it was a different outcome. But, I just hope no one in that church actually is hurt or gets sick or is killed as a result of this, because the pastor is mocking the virus, saying it's not a big deal, it's some conspiracy. And in one of his services, actually asked people to actually hug each other, kind of like openly mocking it. So very unwise in my judgment. Whether or not his constitutional rights have been violated will be determined by the actual litigation itself and construing that order locally. But generally speaking, I just think it's wise, discerning, and loving our neighbor to not meet as a congregation until this thing is over.
Yeah, so I heard somebody say today that right now, vigilance and not defiance is the best way forward. And just for listeners, especially if you're a pastor out there and you're concerned about this, individuals like John Stemberger, they're looking at this every day, and we'll let you know if it's time to stand up and say, hey, you've overstepped exactly your bounds.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and so thank you for your thoughts on that. Just any recent kind of quote unquote God moments in your ministry? And I'd love the story about, here's this young woman that you help protect, and now you're going to be able to officiate her wedding. That's amazing. But any other recent kind of God moments in your ministry?
Well, I mean, just, even though we're a state organization, it's just great when the Lord enables us to do something that serves people outside of Florida as well. And the COVID aid, COVIDchurchaid.org has already been, just thousands and thousands of churches and pastors have checked it out and used it and been blessed by it. So we're really pleased when we can do something that serves people outside of the state. And so this resources has been one of those moments.
Appreciate that. And then last question, if you had a billboard on which you could put a message for the Big C Gospel Preaching Church, what would you put on it?
So you mean generally speaking, or as it relates to this particular crisis?
Maybe both. But just specifically to the church would be fine.
So I think that generally speaking, my biggest critique for the church is that we have become so worldly. And, we always talk about the verse in James that talks about pure and undefiled religion. is to visit the widow or the orphan in their time of need. But the second part of the verse is to keep oneself unstained from the world. And there's just so much about the church that we have just become like the world in our entertainment choices, in our use of foul language, and how we think about life and education and parenting. We just are absorbed with what the world is doing. And it's largely the fault of pastors and churches not preaching and teaching a Christian worldview, teaching what the Bible has to say about issues like modesty, education, entertainment, understanding right or wrong in a cultural context. And because we don't speak to those things, right? Because everything's political now, right? Mm-hmm. Everything's political. The weather's political. Like even human sexuality has become political. Churches don't talk because everything is political, and so we can't talk about that in church. We've bought the lie, and because we're only talking about things that are kind of not cultural, then what happens is we absorb what the world is teaching, and we become worldly. And so the church needs to teach and preach on every aspect of life. Not every issue in the scriptures speaks with prophetic clarity, but some things are very clear. What is a man? What is a woman? What is a marriage? What is right or wrong as it relates to the role of government? What is God's design for marriage and human sexuality? These are crystal clear issues. The principle of conscience, that the government should not interfere with our conscience to interfere with what we believe. There's so many things that the church could teach. And as a result of them not teaching that, people just absorb what the world believes, and we've become largely a very worldly church in how we view entertainment and culture and everything else.
That's helpful. And I know you also have the same project going in Florida, but taking pastors to the Capitol, meeting with legislators. And one of the key takeaways for me from this session was how many times the legislators would look at the pastors and say, preach the word. You know, that we're up here trying to make a difference in our society, but we need the church to be the church. And that's such a great word, I think, and encouragement, especially in these times. Let the Bible define what we should preach, not culture tell us what we should do. Well, John, thank you so much for your time today. This has been so helpful. I'm encouraging to even kind of listen back on this and sharing it with pastors that have been asking this question. So thanks for putting together COVIDchurchaid.org. We'll have that in the show notes. We'll continue to pray for you as you represent the cause of Christ there in the state of Florida.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh.